everyone. My name is Christina Cottle, and I am the co-chair of the INSAR Student and Training Committee. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2017 installment of the INSAR Summer Institute. We are so excited to have you all listening today. Like I said, I'm Christina Cottle. I'm the co-chair of the INSAR Student and Training Committee, and I'm a clinical intern at the University of Utah. I'm going to briefly introduce everybody to our INSAR Summer Institute series. We have a great lineup this year, and then I'm going to introduce some of our working group members who will then introduce our speaker today, Aubyn Stahmer. So the INSAR Summer Institute is a 6-week online series presented by the International Society for Autism Research. I'd first like to thank the INSAR Board of Directors for their support in this event, and then the INSAR Student Training Committee for the dedication to bring this series to life. It's been a lot of work to bring it, and we're really excited to present you guys our series. The goal of the Summer Institute is to promote a forum for the presentation and discussion of autism-related research topics. We want it to be accessible to people who are familiar with the field and people who are also new to the field as well. The Summer Institute was originally motivated by and conceptualized for early graduate students, early career researchers like graduate students, postdocs, research assistants, but we're really excited to invite anyone interested in autism research to listen and participate. We hope the Summer Institute will provide an opportunity for scientists and stakeholders with different backgrounds and from around the world to learn from each other and then ultimately advance our understanding of autism. The Summer Institute sessions are free and accessible to attend live to anyone who has created a My INSAR account. Sessions will be recorded and available for replay following the event. With each 6-week Summer Institute installment, we aim to highlight a new area or concept in autism research. Each one with the goal of focusing on issues that are important to you as participants. Due to overwhelming excitement displayed in participant surveys following last year's summer series, it was clear that the Summer Institute should be focused on issues of culture and diversity in autism research. So we are very excited to present to you guys this year's lineup with presentations and conversations regarding access to services, ethical issues in research, anthropological perspectives, bilingualism in autism research, structural inequalities, and then translation of research across cultures, particularly autism research in India. And we have some fantastic speakers this summer, Dr. Aubyn Stahmer, Elizabeth Pelicano, Roy Richard Grinker, Sue Fletcher-Watson, Jennifer Singh, and Nindi Singhal. So we're really excited to have a great lineup this year. Today is the first session in our series, and there's a presentation by Dr. Aubyn Stahmer and two of her students, Elizabeth Morgan and Sarah Banoska. Collectively, they'll be talking about access to services across diverse communities, particularly expanding services to rural and underserved areas. But before we get started, I want to just run over a few kind of logistical things. Know that you can ask questions to Dr. Stahmer at any time. We're going to leave plenty of time for discussion during the back half of the session. You can ask a question at any time using the chat window on the left of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible during the discussion period. At the very end of the session, we're going to leave a few minutes to talk about career development. If you want to get some advice about career development topics from Dr. Stahmer, please post your questions in the chat and kind of distinguish that it's an early career development question, and then we'll incorporate them in our discussion section. We also greatly appreciate feedback from attendees. So when your session ends, please take a few moments to tell us about your experience today in the comments section. Lastly, know that there are background materials available for today's talk. If you haven't already, you can download these from the INSAR website. It's autism-insar.org. The materials define some key terms and provide suggested reading material for you. Kind of gives an overview of the area and then some really good glossary information to bolster the session. As with all Summer Institute sessions, a group of trainees work with Dr. Stahmer to prepare these course materials. Alan Gerber is an INSAR Student Training Committee member as well as a doctoral student at Stony Brook University. He helped lead the working group session for this session, which included Sarah Banoska and then Elizabeth Morgan, who are also presenting today. So Alan, I just want to thank you so much for your help with this session, and I'll turn it over to you so you can introduce our speakers and kick off our first session, okay?
So thanks for the introduction, Christina. We're lucky to have three incredible speakers today. Dr. Aubyn Stahmer is an expert in the translation of evidence-based autism research to community-based practice and delivery. The main goals of her research include developing ways to help community providers, such as teachers and therapists, help children with autism and their families by providing high-quality care. She's an internationally respected expert in the use of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, which are validated treatments for autism. Dr. Stahmer leads several grants funded through the U.S. Department of Education that involve adapting evidence-based practices for children with autism in collaboration with teachers and community providers. Sarah Vanatska is a doctoral student at UC Davis, pursuing her degree in developmental psychology. Sarah currently works as a graduate researcher at the Mind Institute on the Autism Intervention Research Network Behavioral Health Study. Sarah's research interests include the dissemination of evidence-based practices to underserved populations with autism spectrum disorder and intervention implementation. Finally, Elizabeth Morgan is a doctoral student in human development at UC Davis. She also serves as a program coordinator for the UC Davis Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at the Mind Institute. Her area of focus includes early childhood and early intervention services with a specific interest in underrepresented populations. Elizabeth currently works as a graduate researcher at the Mind Institute on the Autism Intervention Research Network Behavioral Health Study and as the California State Lead for the intervention team of the California Early Start Denver Model Project. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Stahmer for her talk entitled Access to Services Across Diverse Communities, Service Expansion to Rural and Underserved Areas. Thanks for joining us and welcome, Dr. Stahmer.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's a little weird to be talking to a phone, but hopefully we can keep the energy up anyway. I forgot we weren't going to be seen, so I dressed really nicely, so you can be aware of that. So this is really exciting, and I'm hoping we have some nice discussion afterward. We really wanted to talk a little bit about some of the projects we've been working on that are expanding services for children with autism and their families to rural and underserved areas. So let me start by sort of walking through what we'll talk about today. I will start by talking just a little bit about why we're worried about rural and underserved families. Why is this a topic we're even talking about? Then Sarah will talk about a project from our AIR-B grant where we've done some looking at ways to facilitate parent engagement in those populations. Elizabeth has done a lot of work in cultural brokerage as a strategy for engaging families, so she will talk about that area. And then I will talk about a project that I'm working on with Sally Rogers where we're adapting some parent coaching strategies using technology to try to reach rural and underserved families. So that'll be sort of our plan for the next, 45 minutes or so. And we'll see how that goes. So let's just talk a little bit about what we mean by underserved, because there are a lot of different ways to be underserved. So I can be underserved because I live far away from anyone who knows what to do with my child or how to diagnose autism or how to provide treatment. Just being in a rural area or an area maybe in a city where providers aren't willing to go. Dangerous, they feel uncomfortable. I might be somewhere where it snows a lot and it's too cold for my provider to get to my house. I don't know. But there are lots of reasons location can be a problem. Cultural difference may also be a challenge. So if I have particular interventions designed for autism that don't fit within the cultural purview of a particular family or culture, maybe I'm not getting to those families because of that. Or if it's not within a culture to ask for help or to try to get a diagnosis, we're going to be missing those families. There might be stigma in certain cultures around autism or the idea that somehow a parent caused a child to have this disorder, and that might limit access and intervention. Other ways are time. So for families who are in low socioeconomic backgrounds. Maybe they're working 2 or 3 jobs and they can't find the time to get their child into the doctor for a 4-hour diagnosis or to get into intervention or go to IEP meetings. They may not have the funding to get the services they need. So all these are ways that people can be underserved. So I just want to keep sort of all those ways in mind and not just thinking about one way. There are lots of ways we can miss kids. And so when we're talking about engaging families, we really need to think broadly at how we can address some of those issues. So in rural areas, lots of times there are not enough people who know what they're doing with the expertise that we need. They may not have a lot of training in autism. They may not be aware of what to look for in terms of the symptoms, and so it's a lot harder to get evidence-based practices in those areas. In rural areas, research tells us that parents are not as likely to talk to their doctors about concerns, and sometimes rural doctors know less about autism, and so they're less likely to listen, or they refer to the school. And just the sheer number of kids make it so that there are fewer kids with any individual disability, including autism, which means it's harder to have somebody with a lot of expertise in that area. Sometimes rural areas have the added challenge of being low socioeconomic status areas, which means it's harder to pay providers with expertise to come and do trainings and other things like that. And parental education and understanding of autism may also differ from being in an urban area where there's lots of public education and other things going on to make parents aware of child development issues. So these are some challenges in rural areas, and I think the biggest challenge that we've been working on really is how to get services to people when there aren't providers available. Some other issues around cultural barriers are that we know from lots of research now that minority children are receiving autism-specific treatments much later than white children are, and when they do receive services, they're receiving them less often. This is for a variety of reasons. Some of it may be availability. Some is difference in language, so parents aren't comfortable communicating with English-speaking providers or can't get their needs met. And some of it is likely cultural, so even when services are available, minority families are less likely to avail themselves of it for a variety of reasons. So it's not, in this case, just a matter of having the services there, but having services that are delivered in a way that makes sense to the family. Because stigma is a concern in many cultures, other family members may be saying it's your parenting, it's not time to go get services, or it's not okay to ask for help, or families may be concerned about their immigration status and that limits them getting help, at least here in California. Or they may have a different understanding of development and the service system. There may be distrust of government agencies, which provide a lot of service, and that may lead to delays as well. So these are important things to consider, and a variety of reasons make minority parents less likely to advocate and become engaged in services. So that's an issue we'll talk a lot about today, because once minority families are engaged in services, they often really feel like if it had started earlier, they would have been very grateful for that, and would like us to help them come up with ways to increase access earlier and to better services. So this is just a little graph that talks a little bit about the impact of poverty. So I don't know, let me see, I have an arrow I can use. Okay, so higher test scores, this is test scores over here. So high test scores, low test scores. And along the bottom is poverty. So here we have the percentage of students in poverty. Here's high poverty, low poverty. These are for school districts, right? So you can see that if you are in a district that is a high poverty district, your test scores are lower than in a low poverty district. These are typically developing kids. So this is a really cool website, which we should probably share because you can, or it's California specific. You can click on stuff if this were live and see what these are specific schools, each circle. So this is a challenge, right? This is a challenge we're facing for all kids, and the added challenge of special education services probably not leading to high-quality services in low-poverty areas, partially because we've got all these other issues we're working with in terms of all students having challenges with their test scores. So that's just my little intro to the impact of some different challenges we're going to have. I am now going to turn things over to Sarah Vanaska, who's going to talk about the work that we've been doing on the AirB to think about how we can facilitate parent engagement.
Thank you, Aubyn, and hi, everyone. So we know that engaging parents in children's mental health service delivery is critical to family and child outcomes. So effectively engaging parents in their child's treatment has been shown to lead to improvements in the child's symptoms, in child functioning, and parent-child interactions, and also in overall family functioning. Many interventions that seek to improve the symptoms of young children with social, emotional, or behavioral disorders target parent behavior as the primary mechanism for treating child symptoms. And for young children with autism, interventions are increasingly incorporating parent-implemented treatment as a primary intervention strategy. When it comes to engaging parents of children with social, emotional, or behavioral disorders from traditionally underserved populations, so in this instance, we were looking at racial, ethnic minority families or families with limited access to resources, we know that it's especially important to work to engage them. So the attrition rates in parent training programs for low SES or ethnic minority parents are higher than the rates found amongst higher SES or white parents, and we suspect that a large part of this is due to a lack of parental engagement. So at this point, we should probably define what we mean when we say parent engagement. Unfortunately, there isn't a gold standard measure of parent engagement. It's been measured and described in numerous ways throughout the literature. So studies have used workshop attendance, provider ratings of the parents' participation in this session, whether the parents completed their homework, attrition rates, or if and when families dropped out of studies, and also treatment completion. So did the family make it to the end of the parent training? So all of these have been used as measures of parent engagement and parent training interventions. And clearly these definitions capture very different levels of what we might consider to be parent engagement. And that's just one limitation that we face when trying to understand the efforts to engage parent intervention research. Another issue that we face is just like there's no one gold standard for parent engagement measures, there's also no one-size-fits-all approach to engaging parents in interventions. So for instance, in order to increase parent engagement, studies tried to choose locations that are accessible to parents. So often this entails being flexible and allowing participants to choose a location. They might also hold training sessions at flexible times to accommodate work and family schedules. Other studies rely on peer support strategies to engage parents, embedding support groups in the intervention, facilitating relationships between participants, or selecting therapists who have had similar experience to the parent participants, which is called peer pairing. In order to engage minority groups, studies will utilize culturally informed practices. So this might entail modifying treatment settings, style, content, or behavior to accommodate different cultural norms. So for instance, an intervention might be conducted in the home and include grandparents in order to make a family feel more comfortable. Due to the lack of uniformity in engagement measures and strategies, it's difficult to say which methods are most effective in engaging underserved families of children with social, emotional, or behavioral disorders. So we know that families from this population are less likely to engage in treatment and are more likely to drop out, but we don't know how to fix that issue. So in order to develop effective methods for engaging parents from this population, we conducted a comprehensive review of the engagement literature. So we sought to answer which engagement strategies were most frequently used with underserved families of young children with social, emotional, or behavioral disorders to figure out what's currently being used. And we also wanted to know which strategies were most effective at improving parent engagement in this population. So as Aubyn mentioned, this lit review was conducted as part of a larger project undertaken by the Autism Intervention Research Network on Behavioral Health, or AIRB, and Connie Kazari is the PI for that at UCLA, and we also partner with researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, University of Rochester, and Drexel. So we conducted a literature search based on parent engagement using PsycInfo. So the original search yielded 330 articles based on our search terms. And so we were looking for things having to do with parents and engagement and underserved populations or minority status. So we reviewed abstracts, and the articles were included if they specifically targeted parent engagement, if they measured parent engagement outcomes, if the children were primarily under 8 years old, and if they were identified as being diagnosed with or at risk of developing a social, emotional, or behavioral disorder. The participants had to be primarily under-resourced or from an ethnic minority background, and the study design should have been a randomized control trial or a systematic single-case design. Articles are, of course, peer-reviewed and published after January of 2000. So we excluded 238 articles based on this abstract review, and that left us with 92 articles for the full screening. So 2 independent coders across all of the research sites read the full body of each article for eligibility using those criteria that I just mentioned. And after that, we excluded 55 articles, which left us with 37 total articles. We then coded these using a modified version of the practice-wise engagement coding system that was created by Lindsay and colleagues in order to get a sense of the different parent engagement strategies that were being used. We also coded how each study measured engagement, and each article was again double-coded. So the most commonly reported measure of parent engagement was attrition, which we represented as the mean percentage of parents who dropped out of the intervention. We found that attrition was related to both parent and intervention characteristics as well as specific engagement strategies. Peer pairing was the strongest predictor of attrition. So matching participants with another parent with similar experiences actually predicted lower attrition. So thus, engagement with the person delivering the intervention may be at least as or more important in reducing attrition than parental buy-in in the intervention techniques themselves. So the importance of peer pairing wasn't necessarily surprising. Parents of children with special health care needs often highlight the importance of hearing information from other parents who have had similar experiences. Other studies indicate that shared experience can reduce commonly reported feelings of isolation in this population, and social support acts as a buffer against stress. So it's interesting because despite the efficacy of peer pairing in promoting parent engagement, a network analysis indicated that it was the strategy that was least likely to be used in our sample. To our knowledge, this is the first review to document the importance of peer pairing to treatment retention in this population. And so these findings really suggest that it might be an important dimension that is understudied in the literature. And now, studies and citations are important for informing research and practice, but it's also really important to remember the clinical significance of these recommendations. So we're going to share a video clip from a parent explaining the importance of peer support in her journey with her child with autism.
If I had to think about initial advice I would think to get with a parent is to first know, because people, when you start off, everybody has their own idea. They have their thoughts, they have their own ideas on what they think works and does not work. You got to research it all, because you're being hit in all different directions depending on the level of your child, you know, depending if they're verbal or nonverbal, if they have other issues. So the first thing I would say is to obtain the information that someone gives you and research it, whether it be on the internet and whether it be a connection with a parent, because there's no other person that could help you navigate something than someone that has already gone through it. And believe me, they're out there. They're out there. They're either at a school that you might be at, or they're even at a services that you might initially start. But for me, what helped is that network as a parent, which we need to do more, because you have parents that have gone before you that thought that didn't work. or you need to try to go here, or here's a company, or here's a service, you know. That was the greatest, outside of my mother, the greatest thing that I ever did was getting a part into a group that would help to facilitate different services and realize that, your child is capable of having them. They deserve to have them in order to move on in life, wherever that stage might be in their life.
All right. I would like to introduce my colleague Elizabeth Morgan now, who's going to discuss additional strategies to engaging underserved families, and we'll touch on what we just covered in this video.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Well, hello to all our webinar participants. My name is Elizabeth Morgan, and I'm one of the researchers on the project. And today we'll be talking to you about addressing challenges for early diagnosis and access to low-resource families with children on the autism spectrum. But specifically, I will be discussing a few research-based strategies that could be helpful in addressing barriers for families of color in rural and underserved areas. Using the example of the parent's advice that you just viewed in the video clip just a few minutes ago, I want to pull out several key points that we heard the mother give as advice that she would give any new parent that was just starting out on their journey. If you remember, the mother in the video recommended that using other experienced parents who have children with autism can really help navigate this journey. As Sarah explained earlier, the research supports the power of peer parenting for reducing feelings of isolation. I can attest, as being a parent and a parent advocate myself, that the stresses of having a newly diagnosed child can be debilitating at times. But having the supports associated with having a knowledge parent-peer mentor can truly be a protective factor. Another key point that the parent in the video referenced is the importance of joining a support group to help parents facilitate and navigate the services that the child will need throughout their life. A common place for parents to find peer mentors are in support groups, but unfortunately, these types of groups are not commonly available in rural and underserved areas. And when they are commonly not culturally inclusive to minority populations. So, thinking about the various barriers associated with rural and low-resource areas that Aubyn presented earlier, I want to talk about the layers of barriers that families of color, but in particular minority mothers, have to overcome in order to effectively navigate services for their child. We will do this while taking into consideration the intersectional issues associated with class, race, language, and gender. And in the next few slides, we will look at the use of cultural brokers as a tool in supporting these underserved families. So, first we will answer the question, what is a cultural broker? And then we'll talk about who can be a cultural broker for families of color that live in rural and underserved areas. As you saw from your glossary of terms that we provided, a cultural broker is defined as a person or a group of persons that can act as a bridge, a link, or mediate between groups. This person can act as a go-between and an advocate on behalf of an individual or a group. Typically, cultural brokers can be catalysts for change and hold the following characteristics and attributes. One, the person has an established trust from the community and respect of the community they are serving. Two, they are knowledgeable about both the dominant and minority communities' values and beliefs. Three, they have an understanding about how to explicitly translate information from one value system to another. And four, they have experience in doing this translation in a culturally sensitive manner. Cultural brokering is a tool that can be used to support our rural and underserved minority populations, but it's not a quick fix. Many can confuse this with outreach efforts, but it's important to know that it's different and that many outreach efforts are one-way, didactic, and short-term. Cultural brokering is based on relationship, reciprocity, and mutual respect. This can be a slow process, but when implemented, it can affect long-term change. Some concrete examples of what cultural brokers can do include translating language and interpretation and information, They can serve as mediators between groups that have conflict. They can offer information to providers about within-group differences among minority populations. Culture brokers can also teach families about how service delivery systems work and engage providers about ways to effectively partner with families. And lastly, they can also be a valuable partner in research and organizational planning and assuring that projects and plans are inclusive and culturally sensitive. So, who can be a cultural broker? Well, anyone that holds the characteristics and attributes that I discussed earlier can be a cultural broker. It is important to note that the cultural broker does not have to be from that culture that they are supporting, but they must possess those attributes. It is not impossible, but it's not common to find individuals within the dominant culture with a history of established trust and knowledge of cultural nuances of minority populations to be cultural brokers, which is why it is being more common that cultural brokers be from the ethnic communities that they serve. So, some of the articles we included as readings for this webinar suggested using cultural brokering for low-resource families and minority communities as a way to enhance cultural and social capital of these groups. I will highlight just the two articles that you see on your slide, the Traynor-Wilson article, and give a description of their findings and explain how cultural brokering is linked to creating cultural and social capital for underserved communities. In the Wilson 2015 article, Dr. Natasha Wilson Strassfield studied Black parents and the role that parent participation and advocacy plays in IEP outcomes. She found that when Black parents had low cultural or social capital, they were less likely to know how to effectively participate and advocate for children during IEPs. This lack of cultural capital not only impact the quality of the experience of the parent, but also affected service allocation for the child. Both the Traynor and Wilson research found that possessing cultural and social capital were key in determining parents' ability to effectively navigate service delivery systems, suggesting that a cultural broker could be used to translate social norms, expectations, and provide transparency of rules, policy, and regulations for low-resource families when navigating these systems. Hence, giving evidence that using cultural brokers as a tool for supporting rural and low-resource families is a viable option. So now, I'm going to turn it back over to Aubyn to talk more about some of the details of our current research project.
So thank you, Elizabeth and Sarah, that was great. The information that we've gathered from these projects and these reviews, and also in our AirB project, we've really done a lot of focus groups with providers, with under-resourced families, with families from different cultural backgrounds, and work with community groups in each of the sites. We've developed, and we're just now pilot testing, a brief intervention to help families, once they receive a diagnosis, access service more quickly. So I'm not going to share that today because we are just starting and trying to figure out how to best engage families. We are using peer pairing as our method, but finding that even when we are accommodating in terms of time of day and place and phone and home, it's still really challenging for families to find the time to do meetings every week. And so we're really, as part of this pilot, thinking about how to use technology and other strategies to help families get that access to service in the time they've got. So that'll be next year. But I didn't want to lose focus that there are a lot of different types of under-resourced families. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about rural families and a project that we're working on where we're using technology to adapt ESDM to help in Part C areas. And so this project is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, and Sally Rogers is the PI, and we're working on this together. And these slides were put together by our postdoc, Aritz Aranbari, and I just want to give him credit for those so that when you see how cute they are, you won't think it was me. But the goal of this project really is to take an evidence-based strategy and try to get access to more families. So, as you know, if you're on this call probably, we've got a lot of nice interventions for autism now, especially early interventions and parent-mediated interventions. But getting those into services has been more challenging. It's been more challenging in all areas. And the area that this project focuses on really is Part C, which in the United States is the 0 to 3 early intervention service system, because I see that we've got folks from South Africa on, hi Nola, and so probably people from other parts of the world as well. But this is a public system and in our education system where children under 3 who have developmental disability or risk for developmental disability receive services. And so part of this project was to sort of understand what those services are and how we could adapt our practices to fit within those. So we started by asking a lot of questions of people participating in early intervention services across different states and income levels. And so we conducted a survey online with our partners in Alabama, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, New Mexico, and Montana. And we started with the Part C leader for that state, the Part C director, who then recommended some agencies working in their state. The agency leaders completed a survey, and they then recruited from their agency providers who completed a survey, and they recruited families who then completed a survey. So we had a full chain where we could compare how people were feeling and what they were getting. So that was the survey that we did, and I'm going to share with you some of our preliminary results from that. One was that, and this probably isn't surprising, but not anyone is using only evidence-based strategies with children who are at risk for or have been identified with autism in their service setting. Most people are using at least one evidence-based practice, and primarily they're using multiple. So this is similar to what we find in education and other systems, that people are using multiple evidence-based practices. We really don't know the extent to which they're using them or the quality, but they were able to list a variety of evidence-based practices for this age group, which was encouraging to me, to all of us. We then looked at caregiver report of their intensity by income. And so let me get my special arrow. So exciting. So this is the percentage of people responding with either fewer than 6 hours a month, 6 to 15 hours a month of service, or more than 15 hours a month of service. The lighter gray is parents who report under $50,000 a year as their household income, and the darker gray is over $50,000 a year. And you can see we have sort of a reverse loop here, where over half of the families who are living in lower income situations are receiving fewer than 6 hours a month of service, whereas families with higher income are receiving much more service. So when we look at what the providers said they were providing, and we didn't ask by income, what we saw was that Part C is providing usually fewer than 6 hours a month of service in these rural areas of states, and we think that that's because the usual provision of care for Part C is a once-a-week parent home visit from the provider, and that in some areas we see about a quarter of the providers reported 6 to 15 hours, and some providers reported over 15 hours. So what we're thinking is that a lot of these families with higher income are going outside of the Part C system for services. So they are able to increase the intensity of the services that they're getting, either through their insurance or by income, is our thought on that. Then we asked if parents receive parent coaching. And when we asked in the yellow is the Part C director, almost 90% are saying yes, they received some parent training. And this is high-quality parent coaching over here, which is about 80%. And what we mean by that is parent coaching that includes active participation by the parent and directly working with the child with feedback from the provider. So really parent coaching, not just education. So you can see that fewer people are reporting getting that, but still about 80% when we ask the Part C agency or the providers. And the providers are really saying we are doing parent education almost all the time. But the parents are seeing it a little less often. A lot of them are feeling like they're getting some education. Fewer, about 60%, are feeling like they're getting that high-quality parent coaching. Now, some of that could be perception, clearly, but we thought it was an interesting difference given that these are the same agencies. The parents are working with those providers that responded to the question. I'm sorry, I'm totally explaining that wrong. These are the providers. These are the agency leaders. So the providers are actually saying they are providing less parent training and high-quality coaching than their agency leaders think. I'm sorry about that. We are going to parents next. So when we asked the parent, caregiver, here's the green, 68% said they received some parent coaching. Again, still lower than any of the providers. Only 23% are saying it's that high-quality, interactive parent coaching. So the providers are feeling like they're coaching the parents on what to do, but the caregivers aren't seeing it that way, whether it's just unclear whether they're getting that coaching or whether they aren't and the caregivers are just not doing a great job. We don't know the answer, but that is a disconnect that we think is kind of a huge challenge for the Part C system, especially when our goal is to use a parent-implemented intervention. Another really interesting finding was that if parents, we also asked about satisfaction with their program, okay? So here's the percent of parents who are satisfied or not, and the parents who are receiving parent training, as you can see by this light blue, were much more likely to report being satisfied with their Part C provider than parents who are not receiving parent training. In this dark blue, more of them were not satisfied, almost in the complete inverse. I see that someone was asking, again, the difference between parent training and parent coaching, and the way that we defined that was we asked a lot of detailed questions about the type of parent coaching and training they were getting, and we grouped the high-quality parent coaching by those where the person said that the parent was interacting with the child with the provider there, providing active coaching for how to use the strategies. For this is parent training in general, and you can see it's much higher satisfaction when they're receiving education and training from the provider, when they perceive it that way. So we wanted to take that information and take the Early Start Denver model, which I'll talk about in a second, and figure out how to deliver it in a low-intensity way that is also effective. So the Early Start Denver model was developed by Sally Rogers and Geraldine Dawson, and then also moved into a parent coaching model with their work and the work of Lori Vismara. And there have been, it's an ABA and developmental model, so working with the theories of applied behavior analysis and developmental science. It's relationship-based. The overall model is comprehensive and interdisciplinary, and it's both models, the intensive and the parent coaching are evidence-based. And the parent coaching model is relatively low intensity. The idea that fits nicely with Part C is that infants learn through everyday activities and social routines with their caregiver, which is really the goal of Part C, and it fits well within the culture of the Part C and the regulations in terms of putting intervention into toddlers' daily activities and involving the caregiver in those activities. So if we look at the high intensity randomized controlled trial published by Dawson and her colleagues in 2010 that probably many of you are familiar with. The ESDM intervention at about 15 to 20 hours a week was compared with community intervention, and there were statistically significant and clinically significant differences between the groups where after 2 years of intervention, the children in the ESDM group were doing better, and since that time there have been follow-up studies indicating nice ongoing outcome differences even longer than that. If we look at the effects of parent ESDM on infant risk for ASD, there have been some preliminary studies done using just a pre-post design, seeing that with early intervention we can sort of change the slope of development. And these things are visual reasoning, fine motor skills, expressive and receptive language, are turning out at 36 months to be in better shape than if kids did not receive early intervention. And this is an hour a week of parent coaching. Secondary analysis of looking at a large trial of the parent coaching model where parents received 2 hours a week of parent coaching. We see that the better the parents did at learning the strategies, that really predicted child change, which is really nice, showing that the mechanism of action of the parents learning the strategies is making a difference for kids. So our challenge then was to figure out how to get this parent-implemented intervention to families and communities who needed it, where we said are in rural areas, and maybe the providers don't have a lot of experience with autism and don't have a lot of knowledge of how to use these autism-specific parent coaching strategies, and also aren't really sure how to identify autism in kids. And it may not be necessary in Part C because we can do it for kids at risk. So we've put together, based on our survey, some brief modules that can be done and viewed by parents on their cell phone, because 99% of the parents we talked with had cell phone with data access and could watch videos on their phone. So we've developed about 20 video lessons that are narrated and animated with little text so that there's not a lot of reading involved, that focus on daily routines, lots of video examples of parents using the strategies with the kids, and then it's specifically built to be watched on a smartphone for brief periods of time. And then we've also built for interventionists some videos and some brief webinars to think about how to learn more about adult learning, an interactive website that has these self-instructional models. We're just starting this, so I'm telling you what we're going to do. Some group teletraining that'll be 4 one-hour sessions to get them sort of involved in what the strategies are and allow them some peer supervision to ask questions about the strategies and to build on their current practice so it's sustainable. So our goal with this was to really build on the IFSP process and goal development and the parent coaching strategies that many Part C agencies are already using to provide them some additional specific strategies that would be focused on children that are at risk for autism. So our process and our research objectives have been to build the new tools based on our partnerships with our states. We've given it a try in one rural area near here with some providers with limited autism experience and with some low-resource families, and they've given us a lot of feedback. And now we are going to do a larger trial in California, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and Colorado to measure the changes. So the building is done. Let me show you a little video clip of a piece of one of the Help Is in Your Hands modules, the first one, so that you can see what we're doing.
This module, Increasing Children's Attention to People, will cover 4 main ideas: positioning, following the leader, finding attention magnets, and finding your child's comfort zone. The first lesson is about positioning yourself, your child, and the objects you are using to help your child attend to you. While you watch the following videos of a 2-year-old and his mother, imagine that the child's eyes are a spotlight. Wherever that spotlight from his eyes falls is where he is focusing his attention. In order to direct your child's attention to you, you have to find ways to get inside his spotlight of attention. We have a little rule to remember where to be with your child. Here's the rule: face to face and close enough to touch.
So then now we are working with starting our pilot test so we can measure how well this works on a larger scale. The videos also include little exercises for families and strategies to help them try to use the strategies in their daily routines. And then there are also accompanying videos that give some tips for the providers for other things they might want to do. The videos do not use the word autism anywhere in them, so that families who don't have a diagnosis or aren't ready to talk about autism can feel comfortable using the videos. And providers if they're concerned, can just try to use these without worrying about freaking a family out about hearing about autism. So like I said, we're going to conduct a randomized study in 4 states that specifically with low resource families, so families that are at 85% of the poverty rate, and some in rural areas. We're going to share with the family the video lessons on a week-by-week basis. They can get help from their interventionist. Most of these sites are doing weekly, some bi-monthly sessions with the family. That's their usual Part C intensity. And they will work their way through these lessons in the visit. We're going to measure about 6 months of intervention for the purposes of keeping everybody on the same timeline, but providers can work through the lessons with the family at the family's pace and in the order that the family would like. And then we are going to do a bunch of measurement to see if it's working to help the child. The interventionists will get a lot of preparatory material on our website, 4 hours of this webinar-based group training. They will visit with families and then tell us how it worked for them, which we will also measure in a lot of objective ways, assuming we can get the families to fill out all these questionnaires, but assessors in each site are going to go and do measurement with the child, and we will have video record. And like I said, we are just starting this, so I don't have answers about when it works. I see people asking about access to the video, and we really want to make sure they work before we throw them out there into the world, because, of course, we want it to be an evidence-based practice. But once we have done some testing, they will be made freely available. We just want to make sure they really work first before we put them out there. So I do want to acknowledge our lab. This is just a few of the people here who have helped on these projects. We're at the UC Davis Mind Institute, which provides us a great deal of support. And of course, our federal funding agencies, HRSA, IES, and NIH, who help fund all of our work here. And here we are. This is what we look like. Maybe we should have seen that in the beginning. And I think we are ready to think about doing some questions, and I will let Alan start us off with that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Stahmer, Sarah, and Elizabeth, for a great presentation. So now it's time for a question and answer session. Okay, so when speaking with underserved families, such as immigrant families, how do you approach the stigma that's often attached to special education?
So that's a challenge. It's a really big challenge, and we've been struggling with that in terms of what families in our focus group said is what we really need is community education around this. And so then how do you provide community education around a relatively low incidence disorder? I know it doesn't feel to us like autism is any low incidence, but it's more low incidence than trying to say educate families about nutrition or things that are really relevant to most families. And so educating families about development and having the education come from cultural brokers seems to be one of the best methods. And then in terms of special education, our sites that have had nice experiences in terms of that have family members who are part of their advocacy group and resource center to be cultural brokers to families, to talk with them about the benefits of special education or the need for special education and the fact that this is not something the parent caused and things like that. I don't know, Elizabeth, do you have anything?
I think absolutely what Aubyn said, but also being mindful of any awareness campaigns that are being done, that there's cultural representation is also something that we have to be mindful of and do a little bit better at in most circumstances. Families need to know that, in particular, autism can happen in all situations and in all cultures, and so representation in that when it comes to our awareness campaigns is key.
There's not an easy answer, though, so I think it's really an understudied and poorly understood area.
Great. Well, building on that, I'm talking about some of the hesitancy that some families may have in engaging in research and treatment. What are the kinds of things that you can do to help boost recruitment?
Who can answer that? This is really a challenge. I think one of the challenges we have in studying how to engage families in intervention is that the research piece of the project itself is like horrible for engagement, right? So we can have peer pairing and cultural brokerage and interventions that are really culturally friendly and great for families. And then on top of that, we have to have some researcher with a giant consent form and 7,000 measures come meet with the family first. And there are a lot of really good reasons we need to do that because we need to protect families, but also it really, I think, gets in the way of parent engagement. I do not have a super great answer for you. What we've been trying to do on our projects is have our peer coaches come to the consent visit with us when possible, or reach out to the family as if they can't come to the visit, as part of the visit or right thereafter, so that we can get the family engaged and really trying to help them understand the difference between the research and the intervention, and that the reason we're doing the research is to help understand whether the intervention's working, and the reason we can provide the intervention without cost is because of this little piece that we are asking them to do to really help them understand that part. Other?
I think another piece of many of these intervention strategies that you use, Aubyn, is community-based participatory research. So when they're designing the interventions, we're getting feedback from community partners who work with these families. We'll have parents on the community partnerships who represent the sample. So we're able to get some idea of strategies to help engage families from the onset, but even still, that's not going to be perfect.
I think the larger challenge is actually reaching the families who need the intervention the most, because those who are most likely to say, sure, give the research team my information, or to call us, are families who are likely to be more engaged. I know that in some of our other sites, they've had good success at engaging families by going to places in the community where people are getting their hair cut or getting their food or having a booth at a community event to really come into the community and build some trust and awareness versus asking people to come to a university center.
Great. So building on some of the work that you have done on that topic, what kind of feedback did you receive from the first rural site? What they like, what did they not like?
Well, we're just starting, so I don't have the answer to that yet. So, the first site where we split tested, they really liked the videos quite a bit. We got really nice feedback from them. Of course, as with any, I have never not had this particular criticism that we need more videos of parents in more situations, and they're just really hard to get. So that is something I think people really like to see is other parents working with their kids. We really worked hard to put challenging examples in as well as good examples, and I think people appreciated that. We didn't have anyone have challenges accessing the materials, which was kind of a miracle. And for those 4 pilot families, we saw that by the end of the modules that they watched, they were really meeting fidelity of implementation of the strategies that they learned, which we were really excited about given the providers, especially in this particular pilot. We didn't do those 4 webinars. We just kind of worked through each week as we went with them because we didn't want to create everything before we had feedback. And the parents were really learning and could go back and watch things, and they were using the at-home kind of activities, and so we were really excited about that. Now, when we go more broadly, we'll see what happens, but it was encouraging.
Great. Well, this question comes from a coordinator for a program that provides peer support for parents that have a child with a diagnosis, particularly working in rural areas. And they want to know if you offer any data sheets from your research and how you might disseminate your results.
That's a really good question. So again, we are just starting these particular projects. With all of our projects, once we have data indicating that things are positive, we can start sharing them. For the Early Start Denver model, in the parent book, there are data sheet examples. We are trying to simplify those a little bit for this project, but that is a nice place to start for the data sheets. And as soon as this is validated, we will share those broadly. And the same is true with the ARB network project. All of that will be available for free on the website once we have validated it, but it's really important. While I really want to just give it away right now, we really want to make sure it works first. And so now, for example, on the ARB website, this is the 3rd iteration of that network. There are a variety of interventions and tools up there that are already available. So as soon as we can, we will get those out there.
Great. Well, what suggestions do you have for researchers who are interested in utilizing cultural brokers? How would you advise getting started?
Have Elizabeth come on your team. What we've done here is really engage our community as much as possible. So when we started each of these projects, we asked community agencies to meet with us, and they are so willing, really, really willing, in every community I've been in, to work together with us to figure out the best ways to reach families. A little lunch goes a long way. We have a community group in San Diego that's been meeting. We just had our 10-year anniversary, and we started 10 years ago trying to figure out how to get a parent-implemented intervention into Part C in San Diego for kids with risk for autism before we had an evidence base for that. And it is now all throughout San Diego and funded through our public service system there. That really has involved community participants, parents, providers, funding agencies coming together on a regular basis with a common goal. And then those community folks know families and people in the community. Elizabeth, do you have other?
No, I think that's the best thing.
I would say invite your community to as many things as you possibly can. They are an incredible resource.
Great. And in terms of the communities that you've worked with so far, have you found any differences between ethnic groups in terms of barriers to treatment or other types of barriers?
Well, That's a really good question, and we are looking at our focus group data in just that way right now and finding quite a lot of similarities, actually, for all low-resource families. And then there are some differences, right? So mostly it's pretty similar that a lot of minority groups and other low-resource groups don't really feel comfortable sort of speaking up to their doctor, and are, especially if they don't agree. So if they do bring up concerns, which can be a challenge and not part of their usual way, if the doctor sort of says, he's a boy or whatever, like doctors sometimes do, higher resource and Caucasian families are likely to say, you know what, I disagree, make a referral anyway, whereas lower resource families and families of other cultures are not as likely to do that because they see the doctor as the expert. And so things like that have been differences. One very big difference that comes up is that if English is not your first language, regardless of whether it's Spanish or Korean or Russian or whatever, we see that that's really a huge challenge, especially if there's not an interpreter available or someone, a provider that speaks that parent's language. That's a really huge barrier. And then, of course, there are some cultural norms that make things different. So, for example, we were working with a particular group of families in San Diego, and it was not okay for a mom to be at a session without the dad there or another chaperone, and cultural differences like that, again, we want to be careful not to stereotype full groups of people, but that we need to keep in mind when we're individualizing interventions. But I would say there are typically more similarities than differences.
Great. Have you done any research into ASD in tribal communities?
No, not yet. We haven't. We would love to have some groups in this new study, but we don't yet.
Okay, well that's an avenue for future research. There's a question here. Can you explain the difference? You had talked about this in the middle of the talk between parent training and parent coaching.
So that was really for the purposes of us trying to figure out what parents were getting, as we had listed a bunch of different things the provider might do. Maybe provide reading materials, talk with them about a particular strategy, model a strategy and show the parent how to use it, ask the parent to try it with their child, and then give them feedback. So those were sort of different things a provider could do. We were trying to get a sense of that. And so for the parent coaching, what we counted in that is if the provider said when they were in the home with the parent worked with the child, with them together, and received feedback specifically on the strategies. For our slides, that's what we meant by parent coaching.
Great. So I'm going to ask a few questions about, there was a lot of interest here about the videos and the smartphone work. And I know that's still in progress, but have you thought about whether your videos can be used without an intervention? Particularly, this person is thinking about families who have no access to special interventionists. And, is there an option for remote supervision potentially by an interventionist?
We would really love to know the answer to that question, and we hope that that is the next thing that we do. We had thought about doing that as part of this study, and it just got too big, so we're starting with our Part C providers, and all of their supervision will be remote. But hopefully, yes, that we will get some funding to try this with families who do not have access to an interventionist. Absolutely. Great question, and hopefully we'll have some funding to do that soon.
Great. So what sort of generally are the challenges that you face when implementing a smartphone intervention for resource families?
Well, like I said, we've just done it with a few families, and they've been in rural California, so our coverage is relatively good. But data speeds, as some people saw on the webinar, right, are going to be the biggest issue. So we're hopeful that families will have enough data to watch the videos. They are in a a medium that should be as easy to watch as is possible. We are thinking that as ways to troubleshoot, we would consider meeting the family at a library or somewhere that has Wi-Fi, or that they could go watch it there before they meet with their coach, something like that if needed. So far, all of the families have been able to access on their tablet or smartphone. But we're anticipating that connectivity will be the biggest issue, or cost of the data plan.
Great. How do you plan to handle families that have limited access to, say, smartphones or phone service, internet, things like that? How can you involve them in the study?
Well, for this particular study, everybody we asked except one family had access to a smartphone with a data plan. So our hope is that if they don't have a data plan that works, we can have them watch it somewhere with Wi-Fi in their town, because they can watch it on their own time, and hopefully they will have access to Wi-Fi somewhere. And it seemed that that would be the case. Again, we're just starting, so I will have more challenges are going to come up, I'm sure, than we've thought of, and I will keep you posted.
And I think another thing, something that came up in the focus groups, was that most families, we were interviewing low-resource families, most of them had access to a smartphone, but they wouldn't have access to a computer. So I'm not sure how that'll translate in rural communities, but.
Great. Can families be referred from outside of California to this type of study?
For the Help Is in Your Hands study, we are recruiting providers because the providers need to be trained, and so they will recruit families that are on their caseloads for this particular study.
Great, and a few quick questions left on the videos. Can you talk about any of the challenges you encountered when you were just producing the video lessons?
So we're working with a company that's been very helpful in producing the videos, so that's been great. But keeping them in a way that can go on the smartphone, I think the biggest challenges are getting video examples from families from a variety of cultures and in a variety of activities, just because taking video is hard and getting the exact example you want is hard, no matter what. Sometimes families who are living in lower resource settings don't really want you to come to their house and video record them. Sometimes families in high resource settings don't want that either. So that's been a challenge. Keeping the videos short enough is a challenge because, of course, we want to give a lot of information, and we think a lot of information is needed, but we really wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So we've worked really hard to do that. And then having the interactivity is a challenge because of the cost of doing that. So the people we've been working with is a company called 3C in North Carolina. I'll give them a plug. They've been great about helping us try to figure out how to keep our costs down and do some interactive activities so the family can sort of make a plan, for example, for how they're going to practice that week, and then when they come to the next lesson, it asks them, have they had time to practice? Do they feel comfortable moving to the next lesson, or do they want to try this one again? Things like that to give them some interactivity. But I think those have really been the challenges because we're not doing the technology. That I'm sure there are other ones. But
and did research indicate that live or recorded video of parents was preferred, or did you consider other things like animation or to provide additional examples of interaction?
Yeah, we did consider both things, and we could not find research that in our review that would tell us whether one was better than the other. Parents and our community members said that they would like the live action. It's actually also cheaper than doing animation because someone has to do all that animation. So those were the reasons we went with the live action as much as we could.
So let's shift a little bit to talking about language. So there are a number of different questions here about working with language barriers. So how might families with language barriers, for example, benefit from a peer support group?
Well, I think they would need a peer support group in their language, right? So for our AirB study, we are starting with English and Spanish-speaking groups. We had a Korean-speaking support group here in Sacramento and in Los Angeles that we've been working with as well. But again, so one of the challenges, we want to make sure the materials work before we translate them into too many languages. So those have been translated into English and Spanish. When the testing is done, we'll work each of the states with our community sites to help translate the materials into other languages. Similarly, the Help is in Your Hand videos are currently in English. Again, it's expensive to produce them, so we want to make sure they work before we either give them away or translate them into different languages. At that time, I'm sure we'll also have to look at cultural differences in the way we're using language and the strategies that we're using so that they're not just translated but culturally appropriate.
Great. And in terms of access for the underserved communities, we also know that many people belonging to these type of communities tend to lack awareness, or they don't, they're not aware about the existence of interventions for developmental problems and delays. How would you approach that type of community, and what kind of strategies would you use?
Sure. I think, just reiterating the idea of having representation, so both in awareness campaigns, but then also utilizing people that have cultural brokerage within the community to really be ambassadors, to talk to folks and really use that established relationship and trust to help spread really solid information. So those are two ways that we've used in the past to be able to help support that awareness.
So in talking about families with different cultural backgrounds, this question is asking about families that use corporal punishment or other sort of mandated reporting practices as part of their cultural parenting background. What are some places that you can look for resources, strategies that you can help connect with these type of families and improve the therapeutic relationship without sort of spoofing them away from treatment?
Well, I don't know what the research, I have not seen research on this, but in general, what I think clinically people do is talk with families about the reporting requirements and the evidence for the use of positive strategies versus punishment. I know, just personal experience when I've worked with families in this way, then asking them to sort of think about whether what they're doing is working or not. Usually they're coming to see us because it isn't. That their child's development may require some different strategies, and to ask them to give the strategies we've got to try. And usually if our strategies are effective, that works. And so acknowledging that this is not something they would normally do, and providing them an opportunity to try something new without providing a lot of judgment and anxiety for them about what they are doing.
So building on that question, can you describe further about how you use cultural brokerage in development of the intervention? So for example, the focus on this question is on addressing different cultural norms around the things you're talking about. So for example, eye contact, speaking with kids or adults, respect and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So for both of the interventions that we talked a little bit about today, community partners is how we've done it. And so for our peer coaches and our ARB project, we really are matching them culturally with the family, and so that is really helpful, and making sure that they're aware of cultural differences. If they're not, we match as best we can, of course, and not the same cultural, so they can introduce the materials in that way. And the same is true for the training that we'll do with the interventionists. If there's a particular strategy that's not comfortable for a family, then we don't recommend that the provider uses it. And so some of that adaptation, because we can't make one set of videos that is culturally appropriate for everyone, that's just by definition, right? The training for the providers will need to be specific to that. And then as we translate, like I said, we'll want to work with our community members to make sure that anything that is clearly culturally different for that people who tend to speak that language, and again, that's an overgeneralization, of course, there still need to be differences, that we would make sure that we make those changes at that time.
I want to just add just a little bit to that. I think that an important piece to using a cultural broker is it's not necessarily what is said. So the message is the same. It's how it's said and how it's presented and who it's coming from can really make a difference when we're talking about translating the information in a meaningful way. So I had mentioned some of the key attributes, and one of them really being relationship and established trust. Really can make a difference for the receiver of the information, being able to really internalize it and make it meaningful for them in a more efficient manner. So that's a key reason why cultural brokers can really be helpful when we're presenting information.
So given how effective we've talked about cultural brokers and peer partners can be, how can, do you have any advice on getting funding for community services that either serve as or provide cultural brokers? Is there any sort of grants, private funding, anything like that that's available?
So it's a challenge. So that's one of the things we talk about with our community partners a lot as we're developing interventions, is that we want to be careful about not developing an intervention that then they won't be able to implement. On the other hand, they also were happy to have us trying an intervention they might not have quite enough money for, so that they could use the data that we have to lobby for additional funding. So, for example, we're working very closely with our family resource centers in the United States. Every state has a family resource center that goes with the early start programs and early intervention. Most also have ones that go to older ages, and so we're working with them to think about interventions that they can implement, and so the intervention we've developed is something that they could do with just a little more funding. And so they thought data showing this worked might help them actually get more state and federal funding for the project. In terms of research, a lot of grants now will allow you to provide some funding for community participation. Many community folks are willing to participate in projects like this for little to no funding, which we try not to encourage, actually. We want them to have something that comes back to them out of it, but they become really excellent cultural brokers for whatever intervention you're trying to work on. And it is less costly than you would think, because most agencies have people who are really committed and willing to do some outreach for limited cost. But many grants, like when we're writing a grant, if we put a community group in there, we can put some funding for outreach, materials, and funding for our peer coaches, cultural brokers, things like that, writing it into grants that aren't necessarily built for that. But yes, it's a challenge. Funding right now is a challenge.
Well, there are a lot of studies that are recruiting individuals with autism to help design their research. So what are your thoughts in including parents and families in the design of these studies? And what kind of role can adults on the spectrum play in designing these types of studies?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So in our community groups, we really try to include families and adults with autism on the spectrum. I would say here at the Mine Institute, they've been extremely successful at that. I don't know, Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? The challenge we've had sometimes is that sometimes adults with autism are having challenges speaking up in a group that's maybe loud and disruptive. But when we've been able to include people on the spectrum, the feedback has been invaluable. I don't know, Alyssa, if you want to talk about how the Mind does it.
Sure. I think we're really fortunate. We have quite a few self-advocacy organizations that we're in partnership, and we do have, we actually have centers here that our focus is to be able to make sure that we have staff that are self-advocates and adults on the spectrum. So I think that's not as a big of a challenge as it might be for some organizations. So when it comes to planning and, ideas, we really try to make sure that our voices are heard and representation is there for the communities that we're trying to impact, and that includes our disability population.
Great, thank you. So a few more questions about access to the study and the families. Do you offer anything, or what do you do with the families that are not randomized to your intervention?
So for the study for the Help Is in Your Hands, the community ESDM, we are going to offer access to some other publicly available parent education materials and some group supervision for the providers that aren't related to autism-specific strategies, and then at the end of the study, we'll provide everyone access to the materials. And for the AIR-B study, we'll provide families access to the materials. They just won't have a peer coach to help go through them, and so we'll look at the differences in that and check back in with those families at the end of the study to see if they need additional assistance.